Melissa Laurent surveyed her crowd, and something deep within her quaked. They were mostly officers, and some of them wore the dreaded Totenkopf insignia. It felt like toying with ball lightning in her fingers. It was possibly more dangerous. But her voice wouldn't shake. Not tonight. The young German pianist looked at her and nodded, and she leaned seductively over the corner of the piano, drew her crowd in. She let her eyes stray, touched her neck, ran her fingers down artfully in a gesture that hinted much and yet gave nothing. She knew 1,000 tricks on how to capture the eyes and hold the attention of a crowd of men, and she used them all, played them, and none of them would have guessed that she was afraid, that revulsion sat heavy in her chest. Her husky voice hung in the bar with cigarette smoke and low lights, the French words seductive, suggestive. She knew Maurice was watching her from behind the bar, as tense as she was, but she wouldn't acknowledge him. Each of them had a crowd to play. Both of them would close their eyes to the cost. She wondered, if this war ever ended, how many of them who were players in the shadow would be able to look each other in the eyes again. She would go to America, she thought. She would try and never see anyone she had known again. America would be a great place for a beautiful French woman who could sing and dance and act. But first there was this one act, this masterpiece that she was starring in, that had to be pulled off. She looked for him. He was a beautiful man, she thought. He could have been old and fat and ugly, but he was handsome, and she looked wonderful on his arm. He had blue eyes and light brown hair, and he was very fit, a strapping figure in his uniform. When she spread her hair on his pillow and he didn't speak, she could imagine it was someone else. She had to, or she would see Emile's face, and her act would slip. It was almost Christmas, and she sang them songs of Christmas and candlelight and love, and thought of this final act. It had been months in the making. It had started one night in London when they brought her the news that Emile had been shot. Emile. She had thought nothing could touch her. She had thought nothing could wring involvement from her. She had been selfish enough not to fear. He had been 14 and a half and only a farm boy. He should have been playing in the mud and milking the cows and swimming in the canal with other farm boys. That is what she had thought he was doing. He was only a little boy. They had caught him with a resistance message. They caught him and the man who had written the message, and they shot both of them against a barn. She had been 13 when Emile was born. She had never asked her mother who his father was. It didn't matter. Emile was hers more than he was her mother's. He was her baby boy more than he was her half-brother, and it suited their mother. The day she had left, both of them had cried. "I'll send for you, Emile." He had smiled at her. "I'll miss you, Mel." She'd written him and looked forward to his every letter. The war had put a stop to letters, but he'd be all right. He was just a boy. And they'd shot him. She'd promised herself that her family would never drag her down. She'd build a career, come what may. She'd been on her way so well, and then the news had come. She hadn't cried, she hadn't slept. 24 hours later, she had sat in an office at a desk, speaking to a man in uniform. 3 months later, she'd jumped from a plane into occupied France. For 4 months, she'd played the part. Revenge, it was plain and simple. For Emile. For every man and woman there was one thing that made them fragile to the world. One thing that if you touched that, it would completely alter who they were, how they would act. Hers had been Emile. Had been. She played her crowd, she played her part, and she reeled her man in. Tonight the gears were locked for action. The stolen papers were in her little locker room. The Lysander would be waiting for her and Maurice once they'd made their escape. Just this one last masterpiece of a performance. She wondered if Maurice was ready. The cyanide for the beautiful German officer was in the little pocket in her handkerchief. It was a masterfully planned act, and she was a great actress. Her heart didn't falter when he came to kiss her at the piano. "Mon cher, have a drink with me." Her hand was steady when she teasingly took a sip of his drink, wiped her lipstick from his glass with her little lacy handkerchief. Her smile was as easy as always when she handed the drink back to him with the poison spilled in it. "I must go to the powder room, mon cher. I will be back now." Her legs did not shake when she walked past Maurice and gave the sign. Her step was steady when she walked out the back door with the papers into the dark. It was only her shoulders that slumped when the SS officer put the cold barrel of his pistol in the nape of her neck. But otherwise you'd never have known there was any emotion in Melissa Laurent. She asked for a mirror to fix her lipstick. America would have been a good place to go, she thought, for someone who could play a scene as well as she did. They walked her out into the dawn, and they stood her against the wall. She smiled at the squad before her. She had always made a point of looking her crowd in the eye.